Welcome to the Neurokrish podcast. Today we're going to address the topic of neurodiversity, a term that is often bandied about in conversation and one that many young people tend to identify themselves with. And I thought it was appropriate to talk about it on the occasion of the International Day for Autism Awareness, which falls early in April. We will take the Rudyard Kipling approach. I have 6 friendly men, they taught me all I know. Their names are what, why, who, when, where, and how. Let's ask those questions with regard to neurodiversity. So what is neurodiversity? It describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is really no one right way of thinking, learning, feeling, and behaving. It was coined by an Australian sociologist, Judy Singer, to promote equality and inclusion of what she called the neurological minorities. And the movement that emerged in the 1990s aimed to increase the acceptance of all people while embracing neurological differences with online platforms, enabling people with autism, for example, to interact with one another and form a community. While neurodiversity is a sociological movement, it enables people like me as clinicians also to understand and work with these populations. So who is neurodiverse? Most often we're talking about people with developmental conditions. Autism spectrum disorder is a prime example, but attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, for example, is another example of people who are neurodiverse. Developmental conditions like epilepsy can also make people neurodiverse. And this is something that we need to understand. Now, in autism, we have the primary problems of language development, communication, socialization, and emotional expression. People also struggle with hypersensitivity issues. Their sensory problems include hypersensitivity to touch, to sound, to noise, and even tactile sensations. For example, the texture of something they are wearing or the texture of something that they are eating. When suddenly confronted with some of these stimuli, the person who is neurodiverse, for example, the person with autism, may behave abnormally or may be startled in a way that people find very surprising. And that is one example of neurodiversity. Now, when you think about it, we accept these changes and problems in people who have diagnosed autism, diagnosed ADHD, especially children, and we work with them quite easily. And in fact, if you think about it, increasingly, society is becoming more acceptable of such early problems. But what if you were neurodiverse in less obvious ways and grew up not realizing you were neurodiverse and with people around you not realizing that you are neurodiverse? Now that can pose a number of problems because you may end up feeling a misfit a lot of the time, or indeed people around you regarding you as a misfit a lot of the time. There are other examples of neurodiversity in our clinical practice and in our society. People with ADHD can often be impulsive, voluble, loud, emotionally volatile, and we don't realize that it's their ADHD that makes them that way. People with temporal lobe epilepsy have been described to have what's been called the Geschwin syndrome. They can be hyper-religious, hyper-graphic, they write a lot but not necessarily creatively, and hyposexual. And these things make them neurodiverse or different. And in fact, all you have to do is read Ramachandran's Phantoms in the Brain to, there's a whole chapter called God and the Limbic System that talks about a person who was with temporal lobe epilepsy presented with all these features. People with certain personality disorders, for example, borderline personality disorder, who need to experience pain in order to obtain relief from intense stress, and hence they tend to indulge in self-harm. So thus, in clinical practice beyond autism, we do encounter various forms of neurodiversity. And if you think back you've probably encountered your own experiences of neurodiversity in your interactions with people around you. So the question we ask ourselves, therefore, is where do we encounter neurodiversity? We do encounter it in our education settings. We encounter it both in school and in college or university. We also encounter it in our workplaces. And the fundamental issue, if you think about it, is that society is full of round holes. And the person with neurodiversity is a square peg that we are trying to fit into that round hole. And quite honestly, square pegs don't fit into round holes. And that makes them a misfit into the system that we have created. The problem is not just of the person who is neurodiverse. The problem is also of society that is expecting or is failing really to create the right environments for people to express themselves and achieve their potential. So when does one recognize that one may be neurodiverse? As mentioned, when a child manifests with symptoms of autism or ADHD or some of the other developmental conditions we've spoken about, it's much easier to make that diagnosis. Very often I come across people who have reached adulthood without recognizing that they may be neurodiverse, or indeed just recognizing then as they express their independence that they may well be neurodiverse. And they've gone through lives finding difficulty in fitting into various settings with people around them, parents, families, teachers, and even people in the workplace, not understanding why they may have a problem. So thus, neurodiversity is something that can manifest or can be identified at various stages in their life. We even had people who discover their neurodiversity in middle age. Indeed, one tech person who came to consult us did not know that he was neurodiverse. He was in his late 50s. What had happened was he found it so difficult to fit into a conventional workspace that eventually he found a way of working on contract with various organizations, and that kept him employed and happy. He did not have to meet the same people every day because his contract would take him to different locations or different environments, and that helped him cope. He found solitary activity, for example, time spent at the gym or listening to music, as far more productive for himself than having to interact with multiple people. And when we, after a very detailed evaluation, told him that he probably was a high-functioning autism spectrum person, he was so relieved because forever he had blamed himself for his problems, not realizing that it was not something that he was doing deliberately, or a failure on his part. It was indeed the way his brain was wired. His story tells us that neurodiversity not just requires recognition, it also requires a certain amount of acceptance. A Harvard blog on the subject of neurodiversity points out that words matter. Thus, when we address the how of neurodiversity, we need to think about how to address the individual. To give you an example, those like us who work in the field as clinicians or indeed activists prefer to use the terms people with autism, people with ADHD, people with epilepsy, and so on. Research has shown, however, that sometimes people who themselves are suffering from the condition or the problem tend to prefer otherwise. So, for example, they may prefer to be called an autistic person. Knowing how a person would like to be addressed is extremely important, is what the blog points out. Now, if you think that you may be neurodiverse, or indeed if someone around you is having difficulty of the kind that we've spoken about, and you are concerned that they may be neurodiverse, the first thing to do obviously is seek professional opinion. The best people for you to give you this opinion are clinical psychologists and psychiatrists with the right kind of experience in dealing with these problems. Identifying such a person is therefore extremely important. In our setup at Buddhi Clinic, we do a very comprehensive evaluation, which is now both online and offline. And that is something that we find helps us identify through cognition, through behavior, through personality and emotions, and indeed by looking at the person's potentials, help identify neurodiversity and also help give them a path for the future. We need to work to understand the problem once diagnosed, and I think it's extremely important that it's not just the person who does the work, the people who care for them, the people who love them, could be parents, it could be siblings, it could be other members of the family, spouses, friends, close friends, or indeed even an employer needs to understand the problem. Once diagnosed, a person needs to inform key persons in their environment. So, for example, when we work with schools, we often recommend that we draw up with the school a statement of unique needs, and for the school to understand what the unique needs of this child are, how to make the school more productive for the child. In the same way, we can work with families, we can work with empathetic workplaces, we can work with university, but it's extremely important that the organizations where the person is affiliated with or goes to understand the problem. Now, if you actually run an institution which welcomes people who are neurodiverse or has to deal with people who are neurodiverse, what can you do? The first thing to understand is that it's important to be sensitive to their needs, to make adjustments for sound, light, tactile sensitivity, allow them breaks, allow them gadgets like, for example, noise cancelling headphones, allow them flexible seating, the opportunity to work away from their desk from time to time, or indeed work from home if they prefer that. All this is important. Communication with such people often has to be clear. One cannot imply things, one cannot use euphemisms, one should not be sarcastic. Communication has to be direct, transparent, and often it's better when it's written down. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, if one is an inclusive workplace, one has to respect individual needs and capabilities and give the neurodiverse person an opportunity to demonstrate their talents in the setup that they are in, which is the organization that you are managing or working towards. Now, we do end up in situations where we work with clients where we recognize that neither the person is capable of adapting themselves to the organization's needs, nor is the organization capable of adapting itself to the person's needs. And in these circumstances, there is nothing wrong in seeking a change. We have helped, for example, children move into more inclusive schooling environments. We have helped young adults choose careers or choose study methods which are more suitable for them rather than the ones that they had originally chosen. We have helped people choose workplaces or manners of working that are more suitable for them. The key is not to give up. The key is to help identify what works for that individual. In this context, it's extremely important to remember what Howard Gardner has published. Howard Gardner is a famous Harvard psychologist, and what he published was the theory of multiple intelligences. It is not whether one is intelligent, it is how one is intelligent. And the assumption is every one of us is intelligent in certain ways. So understanding your type of intelligence, understanding your potential is extremely important, no matter what form of neurodiversity you or your loved one have. So let's celebrate diversity. Let's celebrate the possibility that we can be inclusive. And let's also celebrate the possibility that every human being can unlock their potential with help and support. Thank you.